Last year I got through about half the lecture and somebody reminded me I forgot to put on record. So I don't normally have to do that when I'm just talking. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started here. It's 5:59 and 30 seconds. Time just, okay, there we go. All right, so I wanted to welcome everybody to the class on educational theory for your curriculum at Boise State. My name is Bill Croft. I am the current executive director of the North Carolina RESPCARE board. I've been in the field for long enough. I've been in the field for a while, and I spent 22 years teaching in the community college system. And I'm currently, in addition to being executive director of the North Carolina RESPCARE board, I'm also the chair of the master's program and bachelor's program at UNC Charlotte in North Carolina. So I've got a lot of experience in education. So hopefully I'll be able to help you out a little bit and just give you a little guidance on, how you should proceed. And I want to find out a little bit about everybody, where they are in terms of, what they're doing. Are you working as a clinician, an educator, or both, or a manager, whatever it is, because it'll help me kind of gear this whole process. Because one of the goals that I'm going to talk about, one of the things I realized that I couldn't do last year, and it's not possible, is that my background is not only in respiratory therapy, but education. So both my master's and my doctorate are in education. So I spent my entire graduate career talking about nothing but education. And I realized last year that this is one course out of a whole curriculum that you're taking, as opposed to a whole curriculum about education. So I really don't have time to cover the full gambit. It's impossible to do. So I want to make sure that we get right to the heart of the matter, get what you need so you can apply it in your daily life, whether you're teaching, whether you're a manager, or even, if you're a staff therapist. It doesn't matter, because the principles will be the same. So we'll go ahead and get started. We'll start with Brandy, and then I'll go around the room here. Go ahead and just introduce yourself a little bit for me, because you might know each other, but I don't know you.
My name is Brandy Johnson. I've been in RT for 23 years. I graduated in 97. I've done all floor care, ICU and ICU. I did education and adjunct faculty staff member for Boise State for about 3.5 years. And I taught sophomores clinically, which I love doing. That was probably one of my most favorite things, and got me more into the education area of it. Hopefully, when I get done with my master's, I will continue with education of some sort, whether it's patients or teachers, or teaching with students at a college or at a community college or whatever. I have one child, and I'm old enough to know better. That's enough.
Okay. Is it Shandy? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, I'm Shandy. I've been a respiratory therapist for 13 years. I currently work for Air St. Luke's as a flight RT on the maternal child team. So we specialize in obstetrics, neonatal, and pediatric populations. As far as education goes, I taught some sophomore students as a clinical instructor. And then I'm supposed to be teaching the Neo-Peds lab for BSU coming up next spring. So I have some education background, but not a ton. And I've got 2 kids, so life's busy that way too.
I understand. Kelly?
Hi.
Two Kellys. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Which one? Yeah, which one?
Well, it starts with an L. Serta?
Oh, Serta, yeah, that's me.
Okay.
All right, so I'm Kelly. I've been in RT for 7 years. I started off level 1 trauma, then I went and ran a pulmonary rehab for a little while. And now for the last 3 years, I've been a DCE at a associate's level respiratory program in Rhode Island. And I have one child, and you probably hear him yelling in the background.
You might hear my furry child barking in the background occasionally. So let somebody in. How do I do that? I haven't had to do that in the past. Oh, there we go. Okay. Noelle, excuse me.
I'm Noelle Wolfter. I've been a respiratory therapist for about 8 years now. I've worked both in the inpatient setting in floor therapy, ICU, NICU, pediatrics. I occasionally rotate to the outpatient setting to do pulmonary function tests. I've also acted as a preceptor for a few different programs for respiratory care. And then I also do in-service training for staff and for nursing with regards to respiratory education. And then on occasion, you'll see my two little munchkins popping in and out of the videos.
Well, that's okay. We're all family here. We'll go with other Kelly. Wait a minute, let's go to Fari.
Hi. Hi. So I'm Far. I'm in Singapore, which is like on the other side of the earth. So I'm actually at work. You can see it's 6 a.m. my time right now.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. I've been an RT for 4 years and I work in an adult facility. So it's a level 1 trauma center with ECMO capabilities. So yeah, my education is basically with my own RTs and with the nursing staff. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Alan?
Hey everyone, Alan Delez here. I'm from Savannah, Georgia. That's where I'm staying at right now. But I'm working up in Atlanta at Grady Health. It's a level 1 trauma facility up there. I've been a therapist for about 9 years, mainly in the adult side, a little bit of peds. And I'm looking forward to getting a master's degree and probably interning over into the CDC and doing research for them because I kind of enjoy doing research.
Okay, just FYI, I'm glad you mentioned that because something that a lot of students aren't familiar with is that the U.S. public health system hires respiratory therapists with bachelor's and master's degree as commissioned officers. And you could get to do those kind of things with the CDC or the WHO.
Yeah, I also saw that online too, and I was thinking about looking into that.
It's really cool. I mean, if I was young enough, I would have done it in a heartbeat. So, I mean, they do have an age limit. I think you have to be under 37 or 35.
37.
37. Okay. All right,
That
Melissa?
is not
I
acceptable.
still got time. I still got time.
Yeah. Melissa?
Hello, I have been RT for just over 7 years. I work at a Kaiser in Northern California. I do specialize in neonatal ICU, pediatrics, but we float everywhere. So it's all game, all time. Luckily, we're not a trauma center because I started out one of those. And while it is fun and adrenaline, I'm not the adrenaline junkie that I used to be. With my master's, I was excited that this program didn't just solely focus on leadership and management, and it had advanced physiology and those things. So, because I was really looking to expand my clinical knowledge. The facility I work at, because we are a health management organization, while we do have sick people, we don't have as many sick people as the other county facilities that I've worked at. But I wanted to, I also am an AHA instructor for BLS, PALS, PAIRS, ACLS too. I really like to educate. I really like to talk. I project like I have a lot of confidence, so people constantly are asking me questions. So I always try to make sure I'm well knowledgeable so that I can answer them, because I don't like to not know. But again, when I don't know, I say, hey, let's go find out together, because I don't know as much about this as I'd like to. So I definitely have a passion for education, but I just don't know what trajectory I want to go yet.
Okay. As you can see, my furry son hopped in my lap. So.
And I don't know if I said I'm from North Carolina. So I was
You are? Okay. Cool.
Yeah, tiny town called Why Not. It's near Seagrove, where the North Carolina Zoo is, near Asheboro.
You're about 20 minutes from me. Kelly Martinez.
Hello, I'm Kelly. I am an RT for the last 4 years. I moved out to Utah, St. George, for my career. I'm a clinician. I work mostly on the floors, the traumas and pediatrics. I'm kind of bouncing back and forth exactly what I want to take my career, just since I kind of just started. And so I've been kind of leaning towards asthma education, but I'm not exactly sure.
Let's see, Amanda.
Hi, I've been an RT for 8 years. I work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, potentially making the move to North Carolina in the next couple of years. I have kind of run the gamut of, I've done mostly adult education. I work at mostly smaller facilities, but I also have done outpatient pulmonary clinic work. Most of my education background is with patients. I love to really make sure that they have a knowledge of what's going on. And, I don't really like when families are confused of what's going on with the ventilator or any of that stuff. And I foresee myself going into education in the next few years. Hopefully, again, potentially down in North Carolina or stay in Milwaukee here with my husband.
Just to enter. Okay. Amy? Amy, can you hear me?
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Hi, I'm Amy. I am currently in the Seattle area, although I got my undergrad at Boise State and spent the first 9 years of my career there. So I've been an RT for 16 years. And then I've been dabbling in being a clinical preceptor with a college nearby. I work in Bellevue, but only as needed. I have 3 kids at home and trying to balance them. And my husband's a healthcare worker as well, and that schedule has been difficult. So I just pick up hours here and there, and then work with the college nearby. And then wanted to get my master's because I saw a education hole in my place of work that I wanted to help fill, either with students or within the hospital, within a hospital, I guess, and see if I can help increase the education that is currently lacking within our department. So yeah, that led me here. I just wanted to do something more or change in how I moved forward with the second half of my career, so to speak.
All right, very good. Well, everybody has sort of a different point in their career, as I can see, which I expected. So one of the things that all of you mentioned about, looking for that next step or, going somewhere in a different direction with your career. And there's so many friends of mine that have gone on to do great things. And many of them, started out, they got their bachelor's, they got their master's, and they really didn't know what they were going to do. But now things have evolved to the point where we have one of our RTs that was just promoted to the CEO of the largest hospital system in the state. We have several RTs that are CEOs of hospitals here in North Carolina, and they all got their master's degrees, some in healthcare, some in health administration, whatever. But they all sort of saw that one thing they wanted to do, and they kept working at it. And when I think about those times back in the 80s when we were talking about getting licensure for our state, and the lack of respect that respiratory therapists oftentimes complain about, and rightly so. I think this past year and a half has changed that quite a bit, but nevertheless, there's still that hurt of always being the redheaded stepchild, as we used to call ourselves. And but we've grown as a profession tremendously, and in large part because people like you want to advance their education. That's really the only way to get a seat at the table. I always make this point when I'm talking to groups in the state, is that when you look at a care team these days in a hospital, you have the physician, you have the nurse who's usually got a master's or now probably even a doctorate in nurse practice. You have the social worker who has a master's degree. You have the PT that has a doctorate degree. You have the speech language pathologist who has a doctorate degree. And to get a seat at the table and be heard, you have to be at the same level. And not because the credential means that much more, but it's a standard that you have to reach, just like with our credentials. And I think so oftentimes people miss that point. You can do a lot of wonderful things without get a higher degree. But when you get that higher degree, you'll find that opportunities will then appear and you'll be able to take them, where in the past you wouldn't be able to do so. That's happened throughout my entire career. Every time I would advance my education, right away it didn't happen, but eventually something appeared and I was ready for it. And that's really what you're doing. You're preparing for the future, whether it's immediate or not. So hopefully what you'll learn in this class is sort of how to advance not only your education, but also how to help others advance their education. Because whether you're talking about patient education, educating students in a college, or staff, you are involved in usually adult education or childhood education at some form if you're working with children, but the principles are pretty much the same. And so we can apply it across all three standards. And so it talks about healthcare in respiratory care or in healthcare practice, education in healthcare practice. The reality is the principles of education are going to be the same whether we're in healthcare or not. So what I want to do is I want to give you opportunity if you had any specific questions about the syllabus, and I'm going to go over the first assignment towards the end. But if you had any like burning questions that you had that concerns you about the assignment for this week. Has everybody read the syllabus? Just to make sure. Okay. So that probably, yeah, go ahead.
I just had one more thing to say with what you were talking about. I walked the hill for about 5 years trying to get RTs on the Medicare budget. And that was one of our biggest concerns, is that all of these other disciplines that worked with Medicare were master level or higher. And so that's why we couldn't work out of the hospital. We had to be in there. So I just wanted to add that to it. So
you're 100% right. We knew that way back when, and it's still the same. And we're still struggling to get enough people up to the standards so we can get included in that Medicare bill. Now, we've made some advancements in North Carolina, particularly with COVID-19, with the local policies and getting RTs reimbursed for telehealth and those types of things. And the plan, of course, is to continue it after the crisis is over with. And we've worked on coding issues where respiratory therapists, we're actually in the process right now of trying to get them to convert some of the charges that they require an RT to be present, say in home care, to deliver, because there's some real concern about people doing things out in the field. We can't catch them because we'd have to be right there, but we have real concerns about delivery people setting up equipment that they shouldn't be. The problem has to do with the structure of home care and the federal government and how they structure the reimbursement. They do that according to the actual device, not the procedure. So their claim is they're not touching patients, but we know if you're going to set up a mechanical ventilator, how are you doing that? You can't convince me otherwise. So we're getting the coding change that attaches a code that a therapist has to go out there when that equipment's being delivered. So these are all things that occurred as a result of COVID-19. So we're going to keep working at that. All right, so if you don't have a specific question about the syllabus, I just want to say that the way it's designed, the course is designed, is really to get you super focused on the final product. So every week, I want you to think about whatever your final product is for this course. I don't want you to recreate the wheel every week. I want you to build on the wheel. So we're going to have topics, but when you do your writing, think about whatever it is. What plan do you have for your educational module that you want to deliver? And now, I know Dr. Koster said that y'all should be focused on what your capstone is, correct? Okay, so you're developing, whether you use this module or not for it, you're developing at least a model for that, how you would deliver it. So I'm going to show you at least my platform that I use to speak from. But I want to encourage you to look at other platforms, to other technological platforms that you might feel more comfortable with. Now, most people use PowerPoint. I gave up PowerPoint a long time ago. I hate PowerPoint. I despise PowerPoint. I was on a $5 million grant, and back in the early 90s, and this was when PowerPoint first came out. And I can't tell you how many PowerPoints I had to develop, and I got so bored with them because at that time it was very static. And I just didn't like it was fine then because it was better than overhead projectors, but we've advanced. And I'll share experience if I have time tonight about my experience in Albania trying to use PowerPoints. It was quite hilarious, but which is another reason I don't like PowerPoints. But when you're technologically challenged by a country that just came out of a civil war, it's very difficult to use PowerPoint. Let me just say, the technology wasn't there at the time that we were on the ground. But anyway, let me see if I can get this shared real quick. I'm not sharing my screen now, right? Okay, there we go. All right, so hopefully my technology won't crash on me, because sometimes it tends to do that. I had so many. Wow. It's always a challenge. Ah, there we go. Okay, can you see that? Okay, so hopefully this will work. You might lose me when I go to full screen. Maybe I don't have to do full screen on this. This platform that I'm using is called Beautiful AI. And at some point in the semester, if you want to learn about it, I can quickly give you a tutorial on it. I like the platform because it's easy to create slides, but it's not really about developing slides as much as creating a visual for whatever you're working with. And one of the important things about education is creating interest. So let me see if I can get this out of my way so I can. That's the problem with this. When I blow it up, it's going to probably. Nope, I'm not going to lose you. Okay, I thought I was going to lose you there. All right, so hopefully this isn't blocking you. I'm going to have to push this down a little bit here. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about course expectations. I've already given you the assignments for this week, and if you don't have any questions, we can shift those to right now. We can shift those to the end of tonight. But basically, there's some expectations I have of all the students is that you get into the work and you read the material. I've designed the curriculum so that you don't have to have a textbook. And the purpose of that is because the textbook has a lot of filler in it. And does anybody have the textbook, by the way? Okay. It's not that it's bad. It's just that we found that there was too much to go through to get to what we needed. So I took the book and I went through the different aspects of it. And then I found resources that went straight to the heart of what we were trying to get out of the textbook. That's why I gave you the option of having the textbook. But you don't absolutely have to have it. For some of you, it might be beneficial later on. But with this course being one semester, 7 weeks, it's not going to be as valuable to you unless you were taking it for several semesters. If it was a several semester course, it would be wonderful. So interestingly today, I was attending the summer forum, the virtual summer forum of the AERC. And so the last lecture was the Dr. Fred Homehelp's education series, happened to be on education. And I thought this was a perfect segue into what we're going to talk about. Every respiratory therapist teaches whether the target audience is patients, healthcare colleagues, or students in an academic program. How do you respond when a learner doesn't get it, despite repeated attempts? Which tools in the educator's toolbox are the most helpful? Now, her presentation was on highlights and strategies to optimize learning. Well, that's what this course is about, is to try to get to that point. Now, she went into some studies and all that, but want to get the point is that whether you start out teaching patients, you will likely also teach your colleagues, and you'll likely teach students, whether it's in the clinical setting or in a formal setting. So you have to back up a little bit and think about your audience. So whatever your project is, and it doesn't matter what it is, the first step in your development is, who is my audience that I'm going to talk to? Are you going to be talking to physicians, fellow RTs, RT students, patients, or even children in an asthma program? What is your focus? Because if you don't define who that is, you will either be way over their head or shoot too low and not really engage them. I mean, obviously, if you're going to talk to a group of physicians, would be completely different than if you're talking to a group of students, because there's an assumption about those individuals as to what they already know. But be careful about assumptions. So let me just give you a little philosophy of where I come from with my educational background. And one of the things that you're charged to do when you're getting a doctorate is to develop a philosophy of education. And I really latched on to the Aristotelian philosophy, particularly the Nicomachean ethics. I had to take ethics and a number of courses like that, but in particular, we had to read Aristotle's original works. And in my healthcare training that I did beyond respiratory therapy, I'm also a whole health educator. So I teach, or advise, I should say. I advise other graduate students on how to deliver healthcare information to patients or clients. And this is with the National Institute of Whole Health. I've been doing that since 2009. But during my doctorate, I had to develop a philosophy on teaching. And what emerged came out of something that I learned through the Institute. And that was 4 things. If you read Aristotle's work, you'll find that this isn't the entirety, it's just sort of an encapsulation of it, is how we should treat people is with respect, operate with integrity, show them compassion, and justice will be served. Because everybody wants justice. I mean, we hear about justice all the time, right? But most people don't realize what it really means. It's getting what you deserve, right? It's getting what you are going for. You're seeking something in your education. You will feel very unjustified in achievement if you don't achieve that. But that's sometimes because people stop and they may have a goal and they don't achieve that goal immediately. That's why I was telling you earlier, is that you have to set that goal and then wait for that goal sometimes to appear, or wait for that opportunity to appear so you can achieve that goal. But this is called the square of common good, which is, if you respect each other, show integrity in everything that you do, showing compassion for others, you will be justified in your actions and others will receive justice. If it could be that simple in life, I would hope so, but the reality is that that's when you develop an educational philosophy, you develop it as to what you want to target. So when I developed a policy, for example, for students, and when I taught as a program director, my goal was always to focus on, what's going to benefit them, but also what is going to be just for them. Meaning, if I've had educators that I've supervised, and sometimes they will, for example, do things like cutting a grade or curving a grade or those kind of things. And my question, when they would come to me and ask me, should I curve their grades? I would say, well, what's the purpose in curving the grade? And they said, so they can pass. And I said, so did the student not do the work, or do you feel somehow responsible for them not completing the work? And it turns out a lot of times, if I looked at their policies on grading, or maybe how they approached it, sometimes their policies were too heavy-handed. And so they weren't really they were seeking redemption, I guess, because they were trying to get out of the fact that 75% of their students were failing. And that should have been something they should have dealt with long before they came to me. But when we would talk about it, I would not tell them what to do. I would just question as to what their motivation was. And then I would give them alternatives or choices that they could consider. And one of those choices I always believed in doing was giving students an opportunity to earn those grades, but not curve the grade. Because what do you do when you curve a grade for a student? or let your staff member slide on a procedure, does that really benefit them or does it hurt them? If you tell a patient it's okay if you don't remember how to use that inhaler, just give 2 puffs and take a deep breath. I mean, are they going to really do it correctly? Are you going to let them slide? Or are you going to let them be the person that, yeah, they're going to, I've gone through the motions, and I never wanted to go through the motions with my students. I always wanted to make sure that at the end, they knew what they were doing. So the goal 1, one thing I don't like about Zoom that I like about in-person teaching is that I can see everybody at one time. Unfortunately, with Zoom, I can't do that. But because of this first goal, I want to move you from what they call the sage on the stage and move you to the guide on the side. Because educators so often, you've probably, particularly when I was growing up in respiratory therapy, when you were in a lecture, the professor stood at the front of the stage, on the stage, literally, and they lectured for an entire hour without shutting up, and you never got a chance to ask a question. And that is not fundamentally sound education, because that's just talking to a group. There's a time and place for that. I like to be in person because I can see reactions moment by moment, and I can pick up on somebody's curiosity and maybe have a question, which I can't do in this environment. So one of the things I want to encourage you to do if you have a question is to ask it. Don't be afraid, because I can't see you sometimes because I have to slide you out of the picture so I can watch the screen myself. But moving you from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side means you're going to not be the person at the front of the room. You're going to be sitting down with that student, the patient, or the staff member to make sure that they understand what they're to do. With that in mind, the sage on the stage, these are 2 principles I want to talk about. It's pedagogy and andragogy. The andragogical principle, which is developed by Malcolm Knowles, really focuses on what the student already knows and exploits that to the benefit of the student. Whereas a pedagogical perspective is kind of what I'm doing now, talking to a group of people, and you're not asking questions. I would rather be over here. That's my preference. But more specifically, let me give you 3 terms. Now, these are technically part of learning theory. I'm jumping ahead a little bit because these are the 3 things that I think you should focus on in theory as a starting point. And we'll get into more theory later. Pedagogy, andragogy, pedagogy. Now, if you read it, you've got pedagogy, which is learners dependent. So the teacher sits at the front of the class and teaches. The student is entirely dependent on what the teacher says. In andragogy, the adults, mainly in adult learning theory, adults are independent. Therefore, they come with a set of experiences that you can draw from. And pedagogy really looks at the learner from both perspectives, that they're interdependent functions. There might be a time where you have to do a standard lecture. There might be a time where you need to pull a chair up beside the student and really dive into the material. So if we look at learning resources, we got teacher-driven versus adult and teacher-controlled versus teacher and learner provided, learner negotiates path. And that's the direction that education is really going in. And if you think about it, that's what we should be doing with patients too, because you're probably aware of the standards for education is that it should be tailored to the patient, not doing a blanket sort of cookie cutter type educational process. And to do that, you have to help the person along and fill in the blanks where they need to be. But the learner themselves actually negotiates the path by telling you what they know and what they don't know. Sometimes it's just a matter of process of elimination when you are questioning them. Learning reasons. So if you look at the learning reasons for each of these, you got gaining next level, drive to increase performance, learning potential, unplanned, and nonlinear. The reason pedagogy doesn't work in some scenarios, meaning that you have this sort of nonlinear thinking and it's unplanned, it's more spontaneous, is many people have to have structure, and sometimes it's not structured enough. So we have to be sensitive to the fact that regardless of what theory we sort of choose to fall in, is that we have to be prepared that there might be some people that don't fit the box. But you will find with adult students, at least, that giving them the autonomy to learn on their own, but guide them along the way, they will perform at a much higher level than they will if you are sort of hovering over them like maybe a teacher would when you were in grade school. So in the learning focus, you've got subject versus task and problem centered. And then pedagogy, you've got proactive and problem oriented. So think back to your clinical simulation exam or a clinical simulation training. When you apply the principle of pedagogy, you're actually getting the person more proactively involved. One of the strategies I used to use with my students, particularly in their final year, is we taught, when I would teach either pathophysiology or I would teach neonatal and peds, what I would do is I did not teach it from a disease-based model per se, but I taught it from a case-based model. So we would start with a case and break the case down accordingly. So we would start with, I used basically what we call mind maps, and we developed mind maps of disease processes. And then we moved on to clinical simulations and application. Not one time during pathophysiology did I ever use a PowerPoint. I refused to do so. Students were up out of their chairs on the board, mapping out disease processes. We even moved it to the hallway. We got huge poster boards. Well, I say poster paper, I guess, really. And it was, I think they were 10 feet by 4 feet long, and we stretched them all the way across the back wall of the health science department, which I thought my boss was going to kill me. But they were writing on the wall for an entire hour, mapping out the diseases. And then what we would do is we would go around, we would do clinical rounds at each of the posters, and they would present their posters and the disease process. And then we would mark it up to show them how they could improve it. To me, that was the most fun I ever had teaching. One, it was during the summer. It was a short session, and it was an easy way to get students involved and get them out of their chairs. They got more out of that class than I think any other class. So I started restructuring all of my classes that way. And that's one of the reasons I really like to be in person, is because I can do those kind of things. So the teaching role. So the teaching role is for the pedagogy style is process designer, imposer, knowledge holder, and director. So in other words, you're up there, you're doing it all, and students are passively learning. What you're doing, what I was describing was basically I was enabling the students and collaborating with the students with the process of mind mapping. But it was also building capability too, because it was putting them in charge of the learning process. So you probably have already figured out there's not one solution, there's not one theory that we can simply apply. But I would say if you're in teaching mode and all you're doing is a pedagogical style, you're going to leave a lot of students behind, bore them, and then they won't learn. Goal 2, I cannot teach anybody anything. I can only make them think. And that was Socrates. Now, if you know the connection between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, you know that Socrates really, he never wrote anything per se. It was his students that did his interpretations. He basically asked a bunch of questions, and thus we had the Socratic method. And how many of you have, when you were in clinical, did you experience just constant questioning, or did they just make you do procedures and not ask you questions? Anybody? I know somebody had to do clinicals where you had to answer questions.
Yeah, we did everything. We did
Okay.
answer questions and hands-on. And so
So you did rounds with physicians, those kind of things? Did everybody do physician rounds? You can just, okay, you did physician rounds, good. Okay, now that's probably, to me, that was the most fun that I ever had, was when we did rounds with physicians. And, when we were at Duke doing our rounds, we were required to go on the x-ray rounds with the physicians. And for some reason, we were the ones that always had to present the x-rays, and the patients, or when they brought the patient's x-rays up, we'd had to present the patient that they were on. And the residents would sit there and listen to us. And they would, so they played us against the residents. And we got the biggest kick out of that, because of all the students in respiratory therapy, we could answer the questions that the residents couldn't. And so that really jazzed us up. The reality is we learned that, in particular in that experience, we learned that the questioning process was there to make you think. If you didn't know the answer, that's okay. You just have to go find the answer. And I think the problem with so many students is that they, particularly when you're talking about first year respiratory students, they'll come to you and they want you to hand them whatever it is. They want you to give you the answer. And it wasn't I never refused to give the answer, but I always answered the question this way. Tell me what you already know about this topic. And I would let it sit there. And they would say, what do you mean? I said, well, you've come and asked me a question about how this oxygen therapy thing works. What do you know about it? Just tell me what you know. It doesn't have to be right or wrong. Just tell me what you think you know. And oftentimes what I would find out is they hadn't read the material. And so I would tell them, you go find me in the book, whatever question you have, point it out, tell me what you think about that material, and then I'll answer your question. Because I didn't want to just give them the answer because they would never learn it. Because you have to engage your students. If you're talking about a staff member comes to you and says, I'm having a problem with this, and your immediate response is, well, here's the answer, because you want to solve the problem. That may not be the best choice, particularly if it's a learning moment, and you have to find those moments. So what does the future of responsible teaching actually look like?
Dr. Kraft, sorry.
Yes.
I have a question. So when you're talking about questioning the students, I kind of find that there are some of the people that I work with that go into like kind of a questioning fatigue, where they just get so tired of you asking them, and instead they just want to be spoon-fed the information. So how do you then recommend us work around this problem?
Let me make sure I understand what you were talking about. So you're in a teaching situation at a staff level, and the person gets frustrated because they just want the answer. And okay, so sometimes in those situations, obviously you do have to do that, but at some point you have to step back and encourage them to find the answer on their own. But the reality is, in a patient situation, that may not be the best choice, obviously. There's a time and a place for that. And I would think, again, I would have, in that situation, I have to really think about how I would approach that. But obviously I taught in a hospital setting, but I was teaching students in a hospital setting, and that's completely different. You got somebody who's got an emergency, they need an answer. It's not time to start question and answer type thing. But if you've got time to do it, for example, let's say they're setting up a ventilator and they're just getting it ready after they broke it down and they don't understand something, and they come to you and ask you a question about it. And that would be a good opportunity to take that opportunity to learn. But if you're standing by the bedside and the patient's struggling to breathe, that's not probably the best time to do it. So you just have to judge that for yourself. What I used to do is, after the fact, come back to the situation and talk about, what their understanding of it was after we worked through that problem in an emergency situation. In the non-emergent situation, I would, say, well, look, why don't you try it for yourself, see how you do. And, I can check you and maybe we can both learn a little something. That way you're not just handing it to them, but they also know if they're in a pinch that you've got their back. Because I think sometimes people might think, well, you're not helping me here and I've got a real emergency. And you just have to, that's going to be a judgment call. So this is one thing you need to be aware of, is that we are in a continuum when we're talking about skill learning. It never stops. Everybody has to do continuing education every year for a reason, because we get stale, we learn things and we unlearn things because we don't use those things. So we have this sort of continuum that we have to think about. That's why a coach, whether you're talking about something like boxing or you're talking about basketball or baseball or anything like that, what is the one thing they do every single season, if you've ever played any sports?
Tryouts.
They did tryouts, but after tryouts and you make the team, what do they do? What do they focus on?
Team building.
What's that?
Team building.
Team building. What else?
And skills?
Skills. What do we talk? What kind of skills?
Well, if it's a sports team, like physical skills that are relevant to whatever they're playing.
So just the fundamental skills. They will go over how to pitch. They will go over how to hit, and they will repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. I've been a competitive powerlifter for 42 years. I've got a competition next weekend, and I've got one in Vegas at the end of August. Every year, I start with the fundamentals because every year my brain goes, you know the form, just push the weight or pull the weight. Guess what? My body knows it, but sometimes my mind wanders. I have to go in and retrain my mind, mentally retrain my mind to get in the frame of mind of competition. So the fundamentals are there to help sort of get you back on track. So anytime you get off track, going back to the fundamentals. That's one of the problems with students that at the college level learning respiratory therapy the first time, you're developing their fundamentals. So they have to practice those over and over and over again. It takes approximately, 10,000 hours to become as proficient as all of you are in the clinical setting. So to become a proficient practitioner, 10,000 hours. And when you have a first year student, they can't be anywhere close to that. And we have to be aware that that can't be the expectation. Their fundamentals are not strong enough. But what do you do every year? You get checked off on all your skills, right? You have to score a certain proficiency to get checked off. Yeah, you know how to do it. You do it every year and you do it well. But the reality is if you never did that, you wouldn't know what those fundamentals were still there as they should be. So this continuum that I'm describing really is an ongoing process. And you've got different people with different abilities, different competencies, different training levels. Everybody needs to grow. Everybody needs to develop those skills and develop their knowledge. What I call as, pedagogy is the study of self-determined learning. Now, self-determined learning or self-directed learning is something that I focused on in my dissertation. That was my entire dissertation, was on self-directed learning in the respiratory therapy student, in their performance on national board exams versus their GPAs and versus their scores on self-directed learning. And I looked at, whether or not one, they were self-directed. Well, all the students that I researched scored very high on self-directedness, which I expected. But the scores on self-directedness had no correlation to the scores on their national board exams, because somebody might be able to do something really well and self-guided themselves, but doesn't necessarily translate into a competency test. So I thought I blew my dissertation, but I found that what was interesting is how it correlated with other factors. And the biggest thing I learned from that process was that sometimes finding out what you think you know that you don't know is something you've just learned, if that makes sense. I learned that we can't always get what we expect, but accept what we do get. The Bill Ford in 1997, I like this perspective. Knowledge is sharing rather than knowledge hoarding. I knew therapists that had a lot of knowledge, but wouldn't share it. I had other therapists that I worked with that thought they knew a lot and they shared a lot, and that wasn't a bad thing. But those people that had all the knowledge just seemed to hoard it and wouldn't give it away. And they were very hard on everybody who didn't have that knowledge. And to me, sharing the knowledge is more, building the knowledge base with your student is really important. So Bill Ford was talking about pedagogy here. Teaching how to learn will be a fundamental skill given the pace of innovation and the changing structure of communities and workplaces. All right, think about 1997. We didn't have the internet. Few people had email. Maybe half the people had cell phones. Text messages, Instagram, Twitter, they were a memory, they weren't even thought of yet. So, you know, forward-thinking thinkers about how we were going to start teaching in the next century was well before the next century. But at the same time, that innovation helped push this much faster as well. And so I sort of deride PowerPoint, but PowerPoint was sort of the start for improving the skill of actually developing programs like this. I wouldn't have been able to get to using something like this had I never used something that I learned to not like. Again, I didn't know what I didn't know at the time. And now that I know what I know, I want to improve on that. And I think that's what learning is. It's always trying to get to that next level of learning. That's what you're doing. So as you begin to think about pedagogy, andragogy, pedagogy, I want you to start thinking about, and then we're going to cover this later in more detail, but I just want to give you sort of a heads up on this. Starting with the end in mind begins with identifying who your target is. When you decide on what your project is and who the target is, the first step in the process is developing where you want to be along the continuum of education. Meaning, if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, which was developed, well, several iterations of this, 1995, and then later in 2003, I think. This was the 2003 version, I believe, which is the one I'm most familiar with. This is how we approach development of learning objectives. Do you want the student to remember something? You want them to understand it. You want them to be able to apply it, analyze it, evaluate it, or better yet, would you want them to create something? What you're going to be doing in a master's program is create. I'm not concerned about whether you remember or understand, because if you can create, you can do both of those things. You're also, by virtue of doing that, you're applying it. But it's important to understand, if you're working with a patient, are you going to be wanting them to create a care plan? Of course not. You want them to be able to remember and understand how to use their medication. If you're working with a student, first-year student, you may just want them to understand, remember, and apply in their first semester. But by their second and third semester, you want them to be able to analyze things a little more critically. And by the time they become a senior, maybe in their final semester, you want them to be able to create that care plan for that patient who has asthma or COPD or whatever the condition is. So you have to, what we call, scaffold the educational process. In your case, you've already been scaffolded to the point of evaluate and create, because you're at a master's level. And a master is somebody who has mastery of the concepts of their profession, not just, I'm getting my master's degree. It's when you say I have a master's degree, you have mastery over the knowledge. And it's not just a piece of paper. It means that you really know the stuff. Okay, you know respiratory therapy. Now what you're doing is you're learning beyond what a therapist would learn and apply on the floor, and taking it to the next level. And that requires you to do the top three things: critically think through analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So what you see to the right of that is the verbs that are used when developing an objective. At the end of this course, do I want you to be able to define education? Or do I want you to, at the end of this course, be able to design a curriculum or a program or a module that could be used to advance respiratory therapy or whatever it is, okay? I want you to be able to design, assemble, construct, develop, formulate, author, investigate. That's what you're doing, okay? So you have to choose your verbs based on, or you have to choose level and then the verbs associated with that level based on what type of audience you're dealing with. If you're talking to a group at a conference, you're not going to expect them to create something, right? I mean, that would be kind of hard, but you should certainly be able to expect, if they're professionals, to analyze information you're talking about. And how would you know if they were analyzing that information? Well, that comes into, if you were to say, the participants following the mechanical ventilation course will be able to relate the process of ventilator settings for COVID-19 patients versus ARDS patients or something, I'm making it up, okay? How would you know if they could analyze and interpret what you've just done after the end? You would have a question and answer session and have them give their thoughts on it, right? You would have them analyze what you talked about and maybe ask questions, because it's really about, it's a verbal test, if you will. And so if you were talking to a group of patients about how to use an MDI, gosh, you're lucky if you can get them first just to identify what it is and maybe understand, what that drug's for. It's, to help me breathe, right? You're not going to say, well, it helps bronchodilate and all this stuff. You're going to say, this drug is going to help you breathe better, right? So you want them to be able to at least discuss it at some level, or explain it at some level, or identify it at some level. So you get the point what the importance of this Bloom's taxonomy is, because this is so important to your project. This is why I wanted to talk about it tonight. So I want you to keep that end in mind as you progress. Go back to the Bloom's taxonomy. I think I have a couple of links in your course on that, and read up on it a little bit more and how to use it, because I look at these things every single day in my job, because we approve continuing education classes. So a lot of times I'll get some and I'll say, look, I'll have to send them back and say, this particular, they want them to do something, and it's like they don't have any verbiage as to what they want them to do. They just put, the topics will be covered will be mechanical ventilation, or they'll do a topical thing. And also, well, we need objectives, and they'll send me the objectives back, and they'll be able to understand mechanical ventilation. And I'll write it back and say, well, wait a minute. I said, you're talking about respiratory therapists. Wouldn't you want them to do a little bit more than just understand mechanical ventilation? Because they already should understand mechanical ventilation, unless it is maybe a new device, understand how to operate the V60 and they've never operated it. Okay. I mean, that's a completely different thing. But if they're not specific enough, I'll send it back and ask them, because it's important that they get to the right level. So this is just the other one, Bloom's taxonomy, is just a different way of looking at it, but creating, evaluating, and analyzing, those are the top three pillars that we're going to focus on here in this class. And then there are learning styles. Now you can read up more on learning styles because we have just a few more minutes left. I will just say that the most common learning styles that you'll read about are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. And you probably remember that maybe when you were in undergraduate school, that maybe they even did an inventory to determine whether or not these apply. And let me just say that, yeah, there's some validity to some of these learning styles. But here's the reality. In the studies that they did on learning styles, when they looked at visual learners, oral learners, learners that preferred reading and writing over kinesthetic learners, the most common denominator was the majority of them preferred more than one method. The majority of them preferred more than two methods. And another percentage of them usually had at least three methods that they preferred. Not one style that you're going to look at will apply to every student. And depending on the topic, the learning style that they will prefer will come out. I would teach pharmacology completely different than I would teach pathophysiology because of the nature of the subject. So you have to find what's going to work to trigger that student. I would teach mechanical ventilation through more of a kinesthetic style and move backwards through the visual and oral styles or auditory styles. This is from the VARC, as they call it, methodology. And the reason I would do that is because if I could get a student to operate a ventilator without even knowing what a ventilator was, by just simply pushing buttons, then they learn to appreciate the value of understanding the theory behind it. I used to try to teach mechanical ventilation in the class and then take them to the lab. That didn't work because they didn't know what a ventilator was. So I would take them to the ventilator and say, okay, this is what you're going to do. And I just want you to push this button. And we would go through the entire thing. And I'd say, was it that hard? And they said, no. And I said, well, guess what? You just learned how to at least operate the buttons. I said, now let's talk about what you were doing. And we would play around with it. I would blow up a few test lungs every once in a while, showing them, what would happen if they press this button or that button. And we would have fun with it. And I think that's important. Now, you can't do that on a patient, obviously, but you can come up with creative ways of getting to every single student. I can guarantee you, if you try to focus on one of these styles, you're going to fail miserably at trying to teach all of your students. You have to think in sort of this circular fashion of I've got to hit on every style. And you also have to know your students too. Some student groups are more visual and auditory than anything. Other groups, most of the groups that I've experienced are more kinesthetic. So they prefer hands-on. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody learns differently. So you will find that the healthcare process of education really parallels what we do in healthcare. It's about assessing the patient or assessing the student, planning a care plan or planning a curriculum or a module. You have to implement a care plan or you have to implement the module, and then you have to evaluate whether it's working or not. It doesn't really change. And that's what's so cool about this is you don't have to worry about relearning a lot. You just have to retool what you're thinking about. Am I teaching a patient? Am I teaching a student? Am I teaching a professional? And the process is the same. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that assessment. Barriers of teaching, you can cover that in the reading, but this is important to review because this will become important into what you're going to do with your assignment. What types of things will influence the ability to teach? Or sometimes we call it obstacles, but it's also barriers to learning. So you'll see it rephrased different ways. But obstacles to learning, what will the student experience that might prevent them from learning? These are all things that are in the reading, so I won't go through it all, but just be aware that you have to look at all of these things as part of the continuum of things that you might consider when you do your project. Because one of the first things you'll do in this week is you're going to do what we call a SWOT analysis. So if you've got a project that you're doing and you've identified your audience, you've identified what the project's for, you can start developing the SWOT. So you're going to look at what are the strengths that I currently have. In other words, this all depends on where you are. Do you have established courses? Do you have established modules? Do you have people that can help tutor your students or work with the patients? How would you affect that? What are the weaknesses associated with your project that you might foresee? I don't know what they might be. These are just examples. And you can look up examples of SWOTs. But this helps. This is the assessment process, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. When we talk about the assessment in the educational process or in a business process for that matter, because this is used in business a lot, is you're looking for what are my strengths currently? What are my weaknesses? Are there opportunities that are there that I haven't recognized before? And what are the threats? Now, it's not complicated. It's a brainstorming activity that you're engaged in. There's no right or wrong answer, which is good. And so what I really want to see is just what you can develop to this point. This will develop over time. So you might discover over the course of the 7 weeks, more strengths, more weaknesses, more opportunities, and more threats. So you want to continue to build this. So don't think of it as this mysterious thing. It's not anything really anything other than a brainstorming activity. What is your project? What is your audience? And what do you foresee as your assessment of things that you might need to work on, things that you already have in your favor, what those opportunities might be and what those threats are. And you can go back and look at what are the barriers to learning to get some of those threats. You can probably identify what the opportunities are pretty easily because some of you mentioned those in your introductions. But don't make this more than what it is. Set it up on a grid like this would be ideal. You could also do it just simply write it out, with headings and explain it. That's fine too. But I think it helps if you have it on a graph. That way you can go back to it and add to it later and it'll make more sense. But if you have, just a couple for each block right now, and then over the semester you have more, that's fine, because you'll include this SWOT analysis in your final product in your appendix. The other thing you're asked to do in the assignment is really to look at learning styles and to incorporate what learning styles you might think about using, how you might use them. Now, I've given you some examples of just how I perceive how I would do it in terms of using a kinesthetic style, maybe with mechanical ventilation training or pathophysiology, which I actually used both the visual and kinesthetic because I had them do the mind maps. There are all sorts of different ways and you might have different ideas, and that's what it's about. It's about learning what your strengths are. And maybe one of the weaknesses is that you maybe don't have enough experience teaching. That's a weakness. That's fine, because you want to identify that. And then what would you do? What are opportunities for you to improve upon those abilities? So again, don't make it more than what it is. So there will be a narrative portion to this. So you can include this on your actual paper, but also provide a narrative about the learning styles and everything that you have that are in the course description section there on when you go to the assignment. So hopefully that clarifies this and maybe makes it less daunting, because it's not difficult to do at all. And like I said, you can look up other SWOT analysis online, and you can get some pretty good ideas and it'll give you ideas. And you may see some ideas here about what you need to do and how you need to proceed. So we're going to have to wrap it up. Do you have any questions?
I do.
Uh-huh. Go ahead.
So with that particular thing that you were just talking about with the SWOT analysis, I got a little bit confused on, are we creating something for just this class, or are we adding this to our capstone? Which I did see something saying I could use my capstone, but I've pretty much exhausted all my opportunities and weaknesses already. So I don't think I could be adding any more to it over a 7-week period. So that's where I got confused.
Okay, so are you asking me 2 questions here? Whether you're developing the SWOT for your capstone, and do you have to do your capstone for this course?
Correct. That's the same. Yeah.
Okay.
How we?
Yeah. Most people want to work on their capstone and work towards that. But if you have another project in mind, it doesn't bother me whether you do it on your capstone or not. But I think you might find that, have you developed your educational model for your capstone?
Not necessarily. I mean, mine is not educational. So
Just tell me what it is so I can kind of understand.
it is questioning and determining whether general practitioners or nurse practitioners have enough knowledge for COPD training on their patient.
Okay, so just out of curiosity then, if you're looking at whether or not they have enough of this training, how would you address that? And this is an opportunity actually to address that training once you find out your results. So you could look at this as a post-educational module after you do your study. That's maybe a way to look at it, because there's always an opportunity to teach and learn. And I think in this case, that's a good example of this.
Well, I absolutely agree. I wanted to do an educational module on it for a teaching purpose, and I've ended up changing it to what I'm doing now. So.
Okay. All right. Very good. I think you'd be fine doing that. Let me just point out, I got to this last slide and I didn't explain it. Let's see, 2007. Yeah, this is 2007. This is Albania. And I'm teaching, these are all nursing students, first or second year, I can't remember. I think it's second year students. And they aren't posing for the picture. That is how they sit in their classroom, because that's how packed it is. What you can't see very well is that you've got people in those 3 rows right there and everything. What you can't see is the majority of them don't have pens, the majority of them don't have paper. One, they wouldn't be able to actually write if they could because they're sitting so close together. I taught anatomy and physiology, cardiopulmonary anatomy and physiology and ABG analysis to them in about a 2-hour lecture. And they wanted the neurophysiology of blood gas analysis, how the neurophysiology of how acid-base balance impacted them, right? So they only spoke Albanian. I spoke broken Albanian. I had an interpreter, and in a 2-hour class, I taught them how to interpret blood gases and also taught them how to, the variables in terms of how CO2 impacts the chemoreceptors in the brain and how it impacts breathing. Not one note was taken. They answered every single one of my questions correctly at the end. This was the last time I used a PowerPoint in class, because I had to do all of it on a chalkboard because the overhead projector melted my slides because it was so blaming hot. It literally burned my hands. So I couldn't use my slides that I had printed off, because what I did is I printed off my PowerPoints onto overhead projector slides. And so I had to go to the board with chalk, round chalk, wasn't even pencil chalk, and I had to draw everything on the board. But I was shocked at how visual and auditory they were, because that's all they could do. They could only sit there. And the structure of education there is very pedagogical. The students only sat there and listened. They didn't have a way to take notes. So this changed forever how I looked at education. And my students, my first year back, absolutely, they were about to put me 6 feet under because they wanted those PowerPoints. After about a year of not having PowerPoints, they learned the value of not having them, because that was only inhibiting their ability to learn. So there you go. My little story. I got a lot of stories about Albania, but one of my favorite stories is how well these students did. And this was actually my first lecture that I did there. So it was a really cool experience. All right, well, I know I'm running over. I'm sorry, I run my mouth too much, but I appreciate you staying on. If anybody have any more questions.
Are you able to go a little bit over the essay section of this week's assignments?
Okay, let me pull it up real quick. I'm here. It takes me a minute to get back in. Y'all like Canvas better than Blackboard? Just out of curiosity. Or did y'all just always have Canvas?
I like Canvas.
Yeah, it's less busy than Blackboard or.
Yeah, I found it much easier to construct reconstruct the course. I mean, it was very fast by comparison. Okay, so the practice essay is what you're asking about, Kelly?
Correct.
I don't want to take this from memory because I got about 10 different pans on the stove. Okay, so what's your specific question?
I guess, is this assignment 4 pages, or is like our total assignment at the end going to be 4 pages where we're kind of just doing like the breakdown, our strengths and weaknesses, like how you just went over?
Yeah. Okay, so now when you say your final, you're talking about the end of the semester?
Correct.
Okay, no, the final one will be much longer than 4 pages. What I'm trying to get you to do is to write every single one of these papers in under 4 pages. So it's not required that you write 4 pages, but not more than 4 pages. And the reason for that is I want you to distill the information to what you need it to. And then by the end of the semester, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of writing. You'll be able to reassemble the paper and have a finished product at the beginning of 7th week, okay? So the goal would be ideally that every single week you're writing a portion of the paper that you'll turn in at the end of the semester. Does that make sense?
Okay.
And the reason I restructured it that way, I took it from my dissertation experience. We spent, not kidding you, 5 semesters? Yeah, 5 semesters writing a dissertation. That's a long time. Every single semester was a different chapter. And by the last semester, we just simply assembled our dissertations of the first 4 semesters and refined it and did all the editing. You get so much more when you can build on something rather than going in off in different directions, okay? And that's what I kind of felt like with the previous program, or the previous version of this course, was that we were going off in different directions trying to cover everything. And the reality is, I want you to be able to build something that you can reproduce and improve upon, period, okay? I don't want you to have to learn all of theories and all of those things. We need to discuss them, but I mean, you don't need to be an expert in all the theories, because the reality is all the theories are just theories, because they're by definition, they're not proven, right? So we can look at them and reflect upon them, and we can say, hey, this might work, and we try it out, it does or it doesn't. We don't know if it will or not. A lot of the things that we do in education are seat of the pants. Hey, this sounds like a good idea. Let's try it. And what happens is we find out it either works or it doesn't work. Education to me is not like clinical practice. In clinical practice, we know much more about, this is going to work, and generally it does because we have science to back it up. But reality is, in education, the science of, say, learning theories, it's a lot of opinion. And if you look at the studies, there's a lot of bias. So you have to be extremely careful when you look at theories of learning. I take them for what they're worth and say, hey, we might be able to apply this and it might work, but it might not, because it's not an absolute. So the whole idea behind the learning theories and learning styles reflection is just to sort of dig in a little bit as to what you think for whatever population you're working with, what might work. And then also in your SWOT analysis, you're just going to do a brief summary of what you found out. Conclude the SWOT analysis in the box, but also include basically, how you might utilize that in the whole context. So structure it just like you would any other paper. Have an introduction, have a conclusion, have a body, and within the body you have the different sub levels of using APA standards, and have your references. There's a lot of references that are already built in to the links that I sent you, or that are in the curriculum. So if you go oftentimes to the bottom of those pages, you can find a lot of those evidence-based material. And of course, you want to do some on your own as well. Okay. So again, keep the final paper in mind. This is like part one. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for attending. I really do appreciate it. And hopefully we'll get you on your way, and you'll fly right to the course, and we'll all be good. Any other questions before we sign off? All right, good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.